Hi, Eike. So today I would like to talk about tradition and specifically start with the quote that tradition is a form of peer pressure from dead people. So as I analyze the issue, I can see that there's a lot of danger in blindly following traditions that were established in the world that no longer exists, and maybe, completely missing the challenges and opportunities of today on one hand. On the other hand, when we look at all the attempts to modify tradition or to do something against the tradition, sometimes it really backfires because it's not that easy always to improve something that was developed over millennia or something, right? Like if it has some element of human nature, for example, in it, it might backfire if we walk away from that. And then another aspect is how individualistic and autonomous do we want to be as individuals, or how much do we want to be like everyone else, or like our parents, or just repeat the life that people in this region usually have. So the personal freedom is also at stake. What do you think about the issue?
Yeah, I think before we go right into the discussion, it would be great if you could define what you mean with tradition and maybe give some examples. Because I think that we're using words like tradition, custom, culture, in English language as well as in many other languages, interchangeably and not very precisely. Some people might understand the Christmas tradition or the Thanksgiving turkey or the way of dressing or the way of eating, the cuisine of a country, or the way that people talk with their body, with their hands, the way that people dress. All of that can be called tradition. So the question is, what is really tradition, and maybe give some examples of tradition so we know what we're talking about.
Yeah, so as you said, it is repeating certain parts of the culture. It can be traditional songs, it can be traditional clothes, it can be traditional ways of thinking and beliefs, and maybe even gender roles are traditional. And basically everything that characterizes society, how it was in the past. And now we're bringing that in without necessarily any other reason other than the fact that this is what our ancestors used to do, or this is
Okay.
what people in this region used to do. It's not
Okay.
something that we came up with on our own today because we have these opportunities or these challenges and we created the answer ourselves. We just repeat and copy from the past into the future.
Okay. So then I would say tradition is kind of anything that we think or do, which is not something we came up ourselves. Let's say we come with a new recipe and we say, oh, that's my tradition. Well, that's your tradition, but that's not tradition in the sense that we define it. Or let's say if we have sex, I would say, well, that's not tradition because you have a natural instinct. You're naturally bound to have sex. So there's certain things which are nature. There's certain things which we do ourselves, we come up with ourselves. Maybe there even certain things we learn in theory. Let's say we read a book and we change our behavior. But then there's certain things that we kind of absorb by our environment. And this can be behavior, this can be thoughts, and those would be traditions, right? Okay. So then we were talking about kind of a fairly broad term, because pretty much a lot of things, let's say, even language could be considered a tradition, or at least the way we speak, the kind of the gestures we make. Marriage can be considered tradition. The way that we marry, let's say we at what age we marry, how many children we have, our lifestyle, all of this can be considered tradition, right?
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. And so the question, I guess, is, so what's the specific question? Is it the pros and cons of tradition, or what is it exactly?
Well, maybe dangers and opportunities as well.
Okay.
And to what degree should we just blindly follow tradition, or to what degree should we just reject tradition and think for ourselves and just be, our own selves? One
Okay.
of the definitions of success is to live the life in your own way.
Okay. Okay. So then one thing that I would say is, um, when you say follow the tradition, the question then for me becomes, follow which tradition? because let's say you live in one village in the mid of Poland and you never have contact to the outside world, then maybe you know which traditions to follow. But if you are exposed to many different cultures, then the question is like, which traditions are you following? Because cuisine is very different, language is very different, the way of dressing is quite different. Marriage maybe is something that is not that different, and I would still consider it a tradition. As we talked about before, it's not that we are naturally made to be monogamous. Monogamy is a tradition that is widely spread. Most of the cultures have monogamy as their tradition. The question then is that good or is it bad? Okay, so I would say you can't. So there's certain things that tradition, any kind of tradition, could have as a pro or as a con. And there are other things that really depend on the kind of tradition. So there's certain things generally to any tradition and certain things specific to traditions. So I would say, for example, pros or opportunities of a tradition are that you don't have to think for yourself. You kind of know certain behavior that works, that makes probably most people happy, and you don't have to question it, you just go by it. It's easier, generally. The second benefit I would see is you don't have to go against the flow. Tradition means most people are accepting it, otherwise it wouldn't be called tradition. So if most people accepting a certain thing as a standard, then it makes sense, and you don't have to go against the flow, because going against the flow many times can be very tiring. So I'd say those are certainly advantages of traditions, generally. Then, of course, we have to look at specific traditions. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's what you described is very accurate. And I would add that there is a personality component to it. So there are certain types of personalities. By Myers and Briggs, for example, it would be like extroverted, sensing judgers mostly, who love tradition because they love safety of repeatability of the same routine, of the tested and tried methods. And they are freaked out by what excites the opposite side of the spectrum, which would be, let's say, introverted, intuitive perceivers who would like to, be creative, be autonomous, and do their own thing, and not look at what others are doing, but check whatever makes sense for them personally. So I think there will be a big component of how we respond to traditions based on your personality. And the dangers are that when you repeat the past, the present is no longer relevant in other ways, and it's just becoming harmful, right? So some of the traditions, if we just keep them, like we would never stop having slaves, and we would never stop treating women as property. And you mentioned marriage, and this is an interesting example because in the symbolic style of marriage, like if you look at how weddings happen, it's like the father walks the bride to the altar, where he passes her as property to the husband, because a woman used to be always the property of a man, either a father who could, for example, sell her as a slave, that's biblical, or, the husband now. And that's why there was a commandment not to desire the wife or any other property of your neighbor, because she was also a property. So if we stuck to the traditions, we would have never liberated slaves or women. So you can see the dangers there.
So you're saying that in some cases, traditions have evolved. For example, yes, we still have marriage, but nowadays the relationship between husband and wife is different from what it would have been 200 years ago. But the way that certain things around the tradition, like for example, the how the wedding is organized, can still show the way the tradition was many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you gave examples of traditions that nowadays we would reject. But probably if we were born 300 years ago and we were not INTPs, but a different personality type, maybe we would have just not thought about this, just accepted it, even though it seems horrible to us. And I can see several traditions, meaning traditions being widely held beliefs that nowadays would be seem totally wrong. For example, persecution of Jews in the Middle Ages. It was like even Shakespeare, the way that he talks about Jews would be totally not accepted nowadays. Or the Crusades, or the treatment, or just having slaves, would totally not be acceptable. But in those days, it was. Even if you look at the American Constitution, they made the certain inalienable rights of liberty and freedom, but those were only granted to the whites. And it didn't occur to them that blacks should have rights and that women should have similar rights, because that was just not the tradition. But nowadays, if you look at it, we say, wow, this is, of course, it's a completely wrong tradition at the time.
Yeah.
So I'd say, yeah, it's possible for us to follow traditions right away without questioning them. And even though these traditions are really terrible traditions.
Yeah, I would say another example would be to the beating up of kids. Like, this was a normal thing that people were beating up kids, and that was considered very good for the kids because they need to behave and so on. And now we see that it's maybe not a good idea. So we are civilizing ourselves in a way by stepping away from tradition and using more humanitarian or humanist values. And that's also a process of leaving religion behind. So religion and tradition and culture are very interconnected things, right? Like, a lot of the traditions are now embedded in the religion. So, for example, we used to celebrate the come of spring or the harvest or whatever, but then religion put a celebration that's religious in that, right? Like, we have Easter or something, and merged all of those, let's say, local traditions with like religion. So now it's very interesting because people think of religion as something that was exactly the same throughout the whole history, and nothing can be further from the truth. It was always changing, and when, let's say, Christianity came to Europe, different parts of Europe, like to Poland, for example, they took a lot of the local customs and adjusted them to make them Christian and so on. So it's very interesting how we have those different waves that go through the world and change the traditions. And it sometimes happens almost in an instant, like Bolshevik Revolution, for example, right? Like, we had a major disruption, like all tradition went out of the window, and a new order was put into place. And how it ended, all of us know. So we can look at the whole history of how we were stepping away from different traditions and how it was ending. And sometimes the results were good and sometimes they were disastrous.
Okay, yeah. So let's summarize. There are traditions can both be positive and negative, both in the general way as well as in a specific way. So in a general way, any kind of tradition has certain benefits. The benefits being it establishes a certain standard of people that they can live by. If everybody would have their own standard, or there wouldn't be any standard, then that could provide difficulties. So having a certain common sets of beliefs and behavior means that it's easier for people to live together. Second, it makes things easier on an individual level if there's certain established norms. You don't have to think about everything, how to do things, because you just follow the traditions. On the bad general side, we can see that traditions many times are not questioned. So basically, having a tradition means that you don't think for yourself what's the right way to behave or to think, because that's already given to you by the tradition. If the tradition is good, then that's good. But if the tradition is bad, then you might not change the tradition, even though it would appear to you that this would actually, if you think about it, would be a bad tradition.
Yeah, and there's another very interesting idea here that before we are born, if I know where you are going to be born tomorrow, I can predict with dramatic accuracy so many things about what's going to happen to you, what language you will speak, what foods will you eat, what religion will you be indoctrinated in, which school you're going to go to. It's probably the school next to your house, right? And then all kinds of things. Which cultural myths will you be fed? Which beliefs, based on the region, based on the country, based on the continent. So it's very interesting how little of your own input will come into that. Like, you will be made into someone from your region and your times by everyone else, and you will have no say in that at all. So it's hard to even see like how people can be individualistic if the culture is so strongly making them in the copies of people who died already. Everyone is repeating the same cycle. So it's just the names are changing. Like, I don't know, if you had a history book of, let's say, some regional music band, there was always someone who was playing on the trumpet, and there was always someone who was doing drums or whatever, and then just the names were changing through the history, but there was always a person who was doing that. So like, do you even exist, right? Like, you are born there and you have the certain path, and it's all pretty much the same, like your grandfather did or something, especially when the times weren't changing that fast. But now we entered the era where the change is so fast, especially because of technology, globalization, and so on, that we have so many opportunities that just repeating the past and staying in the same place and having just one job and maybe one relationship for a lifetime is not necessarily the best idea.
In that sense, that as you say that certain behavior and thoughts of the person are not determined by him individually, but are actually coming out of the culture, the surroundings, the traditions that surround him. So in that sense, I would say maybe that has been stronger even in the past and it's less strong now. The reason I'm saying that is just if you look at the arts, or you look at music, or you look at philosophy, if you look at many, many hundreds of years ago, you can see certain time periods have a certain time of art, have a certain type of architecture, have a certain type of philosophy, of literature. And that's pretty much has always been the way. So we identify these certain time periods, and we actually can see relations between literature, architecture, paintings, and so on. So why? Because people, you say this is a brilliant artist, but in fact, and maybe it's his mind is so brilliant, but in fact, his paintings resemble a lot of the paintings of contemporary artists. So he was influenced by traditions. But nowadays, I feel that's not so much the case anymore. I think for the last 50 years, it would be very hard to define one kind of art style, one kind of music style, one kind of philosophy style, one kind of literature style. It's all over the place. So I feel the traditions are becoming less strong, maybe because of the influences, different kinds of influences that are surrounding us.
Exactly. There is this huge globalization happening. So we have like Americanization of the culture, like McDonaldization of the culture, right? Whatever works in the US is broadcasted everywhere in the world very fast. And because there's a lot of money there and very well-structured businesses, that they can spread the new tradition, which is, let's say, for example, having a birthday at McDonald's, right? That's a new tradition. And then the very interesting example was in the US, the producers of Diamond have created, using PR, a tradition that a guy is supposed to buy an engagement ring that's worth, I think, 3 times his salary or something.
Twice.
Or twice, or something like that. But basically, they have created that tradition. Like, it wasn't there before the 1920s or something.
Of course.
So, unbelievable. And now every guy is under pressure to give them a lot of money, because if he doesn't, that means that he's not like valuing the girl or something. It's insane.
Exactly. I mean, that's a good example. So I remember a situation where I was discussing with some of my friends, and I was saying, look, I would never buy a diamond ring if I got engaged. I would never go to Paris to the Eiffel Tower on a honeymoon. It's like, why would you not do that? They were saying, that's so romantic. It's like, why is it romantic? Saying, well, Paris and the Eiffel Tower and a diamond ring, that's romantic. I'm saying, look, it's just a stone. It's a radio tower that was supposed to be destroyed many, many years ago. It's just PR that fed us, that tried to influence us, to make us think that diamond equals romance, that Eiffel Tower equals romance and love. But that's all, that's nothing true. That's just influenced by the media.
Exactly, exactly. So it's very interesting to like become aware of how we are pushed to this peer pressure from dead people, but also peer pressure from PR people. There's a lot of pressure on us to behave in a certain way, to want certain experiences or objects like you just described. And I think it's really worth stopping for a while and reflecting if this is something that we down deep want, or is it some wants that are coming from the pressure from the outside? Because we will not be free and unless we make our own decisions. And like there is no way to be free and follow all the traditions. Like you either think for yourself or you don't think at all and just copy the past. That's how I see it. But here I would also like to mention a very interesting idea of the calendar. So in the calendar, you have certain days that are, you're supposed to do certain things on certain days. For example, like there's a day for dead people. And on that day, you're supposed to like reflect about death and dead people, right? And then
there's a day for work.
Yeah, or the carnival, or the Lent, or like some sort of fasting, Ramadan, whatever it is, right? So the
there's
calendar.
A Valentine's Day for love.
Oh yeah, let's not forget that. So it's structured in a way that allows you. So the smart thing about it is that it allows you to kind of. It makes sure that every year you will reflect about the death, and about your grandmother, and about your mother, and about the work, and about this, and about that, and maybe you will fast something, and maybe you'll party some other time, right? So it's spacing out, like making sure that you will get a little dose of all of those things, because otherwise you might go 10 years without thinking about dead people, or 10 years without thinking about love, or whatever, right? But on the other hand, I rebel against the calendar because it's not spontaneous. It's like someone else arbitrarily decided that today I need to be thinking about dead people and I should be sad because it's whatever day, or I should be doing this, or I should be doing that. Or like even birthday, right? Like, oh yeah, let's celebrate. Like there's nothing to celebrate. Like you haven't done much just to be born, like it wasn't a big accomplishment, right? So what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I have to think about it. I mean, I think there are two there are pros and cons for calendar. On the one hand, it might remove the being spontaneous. On the other hand, as you say, it makes sure that you do certain things. Of course, the calendar itself is a tradition. I mean, we kind of assume that things have to be organized according to weeks, according to days, weeks, months, and years, but that's also just a tradition.
Yeah, and the Sabbath apparently is a tradition that's 3,300 years old. So that's like a really old tradition to have one day off in a week minimum, right? And I think that's a good tradition because this tradition is based on like how humans work versus how much they want to relax and they need to. Because if you don't have that, if you work 7 days a week always, you will burn out. And then if you don't work 5 days a week and then you work 2 days a week, maybe that's not enough. So it's very wise, I think, to have that Sabbath. Or in certain traditions, you have fasting, which is also highly beneficial for health. And then you have also like, some festives that you eat a lot, and that may be also good for some reason, right? Like so just to experience all of it within the year has some value to it.
Right. Okay. So my question would be, we looked at traditions in a general way, and we saw that there are certain pros to traditions, opportunities of traditions, and certain cons or dangers of traditions. Now, I'd like to see what specific traditions do you see that good tradition? One day off? The 1 day off is a good tradition.
Yeah, that there was some like connection problem, but you were saying that what traditions are good, right?
What traditions are good and what traditions are bad. You were saying to have 1 day off is a good tradition.
I do believe so.
Okay, so what are kind of the traditions that you think are bad, or what other traditions are good?
Well, it depends on the particular also culture and so on. But for example, anything that's, like women as property, or beat up your kids or beat up your wife or whatever, those traditions should go away. Slavery was a bad tradition as well. And still in some places in the world, you would see that. And then in general, everything that's like
So
limiting
you're
the
saying
individual.
traditions, even though they are part of the Bible, should go away. Like, for example, slavery is part of the Bible, and also the subjugation of the woman to her husband is part of the Bible. But you're saying no matter that's part of the Bible, that's a bad tradition.
Yes. And the whole tradition does not take into account, for example, safe sex. And then I think in
But
general,
I
even
mean,
like,
you're not supposed to have sex before you're getting married. And if nobody has sex before they get married, there's no sexual diseases anyway.
yeah, but those rules were written before we had contraception, for example. So we need to like take into account the fact that we now do have contraception. So that's my point, right?
Okay, so you're saying that's maybe one of the reasons why traditions can be sometimes good and sometimes bad, depending on how the environment evolves. So just having one sexual partner was good before any contraception was there. Now that we have contraception, maybe that tradition doesn't make sense anymore.
Yes, and we live much longer, and there's a lot of different reasons. But for example, like something that maybe people don't realize, like in 2004, Poland joined European Union. So now we are allowed to live anywhere in Europe in Schengen zone and study and open any kind of business and so on. But people have not realized that at all. Like most people still think that like if you're born in this village, you have to live in this village and die in this village. And it's like the borders opened up, but the minds of most people didn't. Like they don't consider that to be their country in a way, because it is like they can totally go and live wherever they want, right? So that's one of the dangers, that like maybe the limitation will lift up and will not no longer be there, but people will still perceive it because they're used traditionally to think very small and very local, and maybe think in more like nationalistic terms, like, oh, this is my tribe, these are my people are better because they're from this country and not that country, instead of thinking maybe more global. So we need to leave a lot of the paradigms behind in order to fully embrace the freedoms that we now have with cheap travel, with Schengen zone, with all kinds of things, the internet, access to the information, right? So our software here and beliefs are not updated for fully utilizing the potential that we were given recently.
Okay, so sometimes certain traditions can be good, but then the environment changes and traditions can become bad. So can you give us some more examples of bad traditions? You already said slavery, the woman being property of the husband, monogamy, only having one sexual partner. You said it's a bad tradition nowadays because now we have contraception. But is there any other example that you would like to mention for a bad tradition? A bad tradition I would define as a tradition that makes us either unhappy or doesn't lead to productivity. Or do you have examples of good traditions?
Yeah, so I was also mentioning, for example, beating up kids, right? Like
Oh yeah, that's true.
violence against kids, that was one of them. So you can look at the last 70 years or something, and the progress we've made was actually based on leaving those traditions behind. And now we have like rights of different groups of Black people, of gay people, and so on. They're making certain progress, in becoming more equal. That's also leaving up certain traditions behind. And then good traditions, yes, we mentioned Sabbath and some sort of fasting. In general, in the year, celebrations of different seasons, like, oh, we have harvest. This was very typical in the agrarian society. So that's probably good traditions based on giving thanks and gratitude, and maybe going together, the whole community, and singing local songs or whatever. Like there's a lot of rituals that are still valid if people wanted to do them. And then we have all the clothing that was also traditional, that looks really nice. It's not like people in those regions necessarily wear it 24/7, but some people sometimes wear the traditional clothing of the region, and this certain value as well.
Okay. Um, I can come up with some other traditions that I would consider bad traditions.
Yeah.
So one of the traditions is fireworks. Looks nice, but is very dangerous. People die every year of fireworks. Makes a huge environmental mess. Baby dropping. For example, in India, there are some villages where newborns have to be dropped and then caught by the villagers. They drop from a high tower, and sometimes babies die. It's a bad tradition, I would say. I'd say the bull runs in Pamplona is a bad tradition. I'd say bull fights in Spain are a bad tradition. For me personally, because it's killing animals. Of course, we kill animals for eating meat, but I think it's a nonsensical killing. I'd say female circumcision is a bad tradition. I'd say college hazings, where new entrants to fraternities have to go through certain tests, and sometimes people die. That's a bad tradition. I'd say hunting is, for me, kind of like bullfights. It's a bad tradition. What other bad traditions do you see?
I was actually about to mention hunting, and then you did, and it's a very, very good example as well. Yeah. But what about maybe it's a bad tradition that we send children to schools that were designed for 19th century industrial age and are completely irrelevant to modern age, internet enabled reality, where we could design schools from scratch, given what we know now about everything, and they would be completely different than they are. And
Exactly.
maybe that's also a bad tradition. We just repeat the same thing every year, and yeah.
I agree. I mean, I think if you were to look at the school curriculum and you were just to ask yourself, what are the subjects that a child or a young adult needs to know in order to be a good, happy human being in our society, the school curriculum would look different. I think the reason people continue with the school curriculum is just because that's what they were taught, and that's why they feel those subjects that they were taught are the important subjects. And that's why they have to continue teaching them. But if they really were to do an analysis, they would come to a different conclusion.
Exactly. So there is certain inertia, there's certain momentum of the past that enters the future without us necessarily always verifying if it's still relevant. So society needs those people who have new ways of thinking, like INTPs, and there needs to be certain debate or even fight between the conservatives and the liberals so that only the best ideas will modify our reality and survive, because it's very easy to have a bad idea, hashtag communist, for example. Let's revolutionize the world, poof, and it didn't work. So, there needs to be kind of close cooperation or debate or something with people who say, no, the old way is better, and people who say, no, the new way is better, so that only the best new ways are going to replace the bad past ways.
Okay, but you were saying that, or you were both saying that it's difficult sometimes when you are born into a tradition to kind of get out of that tradition and see things from an outsider's perspective. And you were saying that the people that are most able to do that are people like you and me, INTPs, meaning introverted, intuitive, thinking oriented, and perceiving, meaning kind of not tradition bound. And those people kind of have the obligation also, as far as I understand you, to kind of think about if traditions make sense or what other ways we could have to see things or to do things. So I'd ask you, where do you see yourself consciously breaking traditions? And which kind of traditions do you see? I mean, these are two questions. Where do you see yourself breaking traditions? And then the second question I'd like to discuss is, which traditions do you feel will be changing or should be changing in the future? Maybe to the first question first. Where do you see yourself breaking traditions?
In many places. So traditionally, I'm in the age where I'm supposed to have wife, children, mortgage, job, religion, and I have none of those things.
Mhm.
Right? So I live in my own way, and that's one thing. And then another thing that I'm trying to bring to the world as a new way of looking at things is in my business. For example, there was a tradition of teaching beginners in English uh, stuff like colors, all colors in English, all animals in English, alphabet in English, all of that as like first lessons. Whereas
Mhm.
I came up with an idea, hey, let's teach 1,000 most commonly used words so that the person can quickly begin to understand about 80% of the content, and let's not worry about how to say pink elephant when the person doesn't know how to say you, have, and so on.
Okay. Mhm.
How about you?
Okay. Where do I act differently according to traditions? I think that generally, and I often go against the flow. For example, um, when just as you mentioned before, uh, most people would say, well, let's just do a traditional subject in my country. And I said, well, why wouldn't I want to go abroad? I would learn much more abroad. So that was when I was 14. I decided I'm going to go abroad. So when I was 16, I went abroad. And then I thought, okay, why not just go to keep on moving? Because I'm going to expand my mental horizon. So that's why I went to the US, to France, to Italy, to Spain, and so on. Then just didn't have a knife. So then I just ate it like this, like an apple. And then I thought, oh, that actually makes a lot of sense. It's convenient. So then I continued doing that. And people always looked at me strangely, like, why are you eating a pepper like this? You're supposed to cut it. It's like, no, I'm not supposed to cut it. I can just eat it like an apple. It's convenient. Or I remember I was in a dance lesson, and there were the girls dancing with girls, and then there were one time there were more guys and girls. And so I just went to another guy and said, let's dance. It's like, whoa, I know. I'm not gay. It's like, okay, all right. But for me, it's like, why wouldn't I want to dance? Because I'm just touching the hands, right? So why wouldn't you dance? And I feel it's a tradition. It's a stereotype we have. Or let's say, for example, in the metro, and when I'm in the subway, waiting for the train to come, I would always do something productive. So I would, for example, do a lot of exercise or stretching, and people always look at me strangely, like, "Whoa, what's this guy doing there?" And I'm gonna say, "Well, I'm not bothering anybody. I'm just doing my thing." But I know that other people would kind of feel the social pressure, and they wouldn't do it. So yeah, there are several examples
Mhm.
of me kind of not willing to be stuck in the social pressure.
Exactly. This is very unique, I think, to certain personality types, because some other types want to belong and want to have predictable everything and want to be liked by other people. And for us, like being liked by other people is less important than doing our own individual thing that we figured out for ourselves that works. It's very interesting, this internal way of like deciding, like there's internal authority versus the external authority, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
some people will only look at what other people are doing or saying, and that's what they will do. For us, it's more like, what do I want to do? And then we do
Mm-hmm.
that. I
Mm-hmm.
remember my parents saying this thing, like, let's say I messed up something when other kids also did the same. So I was like, why did you do that? And I'm like, well, because everyone did it. And they're like, oh, but if everyone was like jumping off the cliff, would you do this as well? I'm like, so you got to think for yourself. And I'm like, yeah, I think I learned that. So now I'm kind of skeptical of what everyone else is doing, because it's very unlikely that everyone is going to the top, for example.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to be on the top of any field, you cannot do what the majority of the people are doing there, because majority of people are average. So you have to have your strange ways, because there are only strange ways on the top in the end. If just doing what everyone else is doing was landing you at, I don't know, billionaire status, then everyone would be a billionaire, but it's not like that, right?
Exactly. Okay. And by the way, I remember that Peter Thiel, in interviews, he always, or like in I think interviews in companies he wants to invest in, he always asks the founders to give examples of contrarian thinking. So are there any situations where your thinking or your action goes against the majority? And he's saying that's a very good predictor of both intelligence and entrepreneurial success. They actually come up with ways where they are thinking differently from the majority.
That makes a lot of sense. And this is the role of INTPs. I read the book about INTPs, that actually we need to look at the society and analyze if the herd, if everyone without looking is not going to jump off the cliff without, knowing about it. And then if we see something, we need to like raise concerns, and we will pay the price for that, which is, everyone will be like, oh, you are bad because you're just like going against tradition or whatever. But it's a stupid tradition, but no one wants to admit it because no one wants to even reflect on it. That's the crazy part. Like, a lot of people never even considered that, for example, their religion might be false, right? Like it never even crossed their mind. But if they start considering certain things, then maybe they will also see the point.
Okay, I agree. So maybe final question would be, which are some of the traditions or some of the customs or some of the widely held beliefs that you feel are wrong and you think or you hope for them to be changed? I mean, we already mentioned you already mentioned that the wife being seen as the property of the husband. You already mentioned slavery, which pretty much has been, I guess, eradicated. We already mentioned that, or you already mentioned that monogamous marriage being a bit more liberal. I guess you would like to see that happening. What other traditions? Maybe less beating of children.
And in general, more reflection. I think that would help, just like instead of blindly copying the past into the future, just once in a while stop and just like reflect, hey, maybe there's a better way. Is this making any sense, right? Because the thing is that sometimes we copy those things without even believing. So for example, one of the things that happens is that atheists have a child and they go and baptize that child and then send it to religious classes, not because they believe in it, but because there's a pressure from society. And then if everyone is like basically doing this and thinking that everyone else is expecting them to do it, it's almost like this, the king is naked. Like there's this story about like, the new clothes of the Caesar or something it's called. And no one is actually stepping up to willingly admit that something is wrong. Like no one is addressing the elephant in the room, but everyone thinks that everyone else will think badly about them, so they comply. And maybe no one in this community actually, for example, believes, but everyone will send their kids to religion because everyone thinks that everyone else would be thinking badly about them. So a little bit of courage, I think, would to stand behind your truth and to say it how it is. Actually, I was just listening to the
Go ahead.
He was saying that like, you need to state your truth and how you actually see it, because otherwise there will be lies and people will live in lies and no one will step up and like say how it is.
I think, personally, I have two examples when I've been in this situation where on the one hand, I want to be liked and I want to be the way that other people want me to be. And on the other hand, I feel this is not right. This is not true. And so one of the examples is religion. Like I was in a community of many religious people. And I would just have loved to tell them, look, I totally agree with what you say. I also believe in Jesus Christ as my savior. But then on the other hand, I just looked at this and I'm like, no, this doesn't make sense. And I prayed it would make sense to me, but it just didn't. And so what do I do? Because if I tell them, look, sorry, and I start arguing with them and say, no, this doesn't make sense, then they're gonna say, ooh, you're a bad person. Another thing, even more controversial, is that in many ways, I would agree with the policies of Donald Trump. And so in the US, it's kind of like bashing Trump is like it's like a bonding exercise. You know, you bash Trump, you say he's terrible, and then people say, yeah, I agree, he's terrible, and you kind of bond on that. So if I'm in a community of people saying that, and I say, well, actually, I think some of the policies make sense, I don't think he's a bad president, I'm kind of the outsider, and I feel rejected, and I get rejected. So it's like, what do I do? Because I want to be accepted by them, but many people don't have the open mind and they would reject me. So do I stand up and say, no, for these reasons, I share your values, but for these reasons, I disagree with you? Or do I just say, I don't discuss anything and just say, I agree with you?
Yeah, I think we are obliged to speak our own truth. And otherwise, we will live in the world where everyone is basically pretending someone they're not, and that might lead to catastrophic results. If we look at those examples like communism and so on, it was basically all based on a lie, and everyone was participating in that lie. Everyone was lying every day. Like, people were pretending that they work, and the state was pretending that it's paying them, and everything was like fake. So unless we state our truth, and especially now that there aren't that big consequences. Like, if you were in, I don't know, Saudi Arabia, and then you said that you are an atheist, they may kill you. But if you live in the West and you have certain views and there's freedom of speech, and unless you
Well,
spread hatred,
not now. That's the problem. Not now. Like, if you say you support Trump, like, you kind of let's say you are living in New York, you're not gonna get any dates if you said it. Like, seriously, your friends are probably gonna say, I don't want to be friends with you anymore. They're gonna block you on Facebook. Like, it's really bad.
Well, but then there's the half of Americans that voted for Trump, and they will love you. So, like, you are insisting on hanging out with people who are against Trump, and then telling them that you are for Trump. But like, maybe you just need to switch friends to the ones that agree with you. I don't know. Oh, maybe that's the way to find your true friends who will resonate with your values, because once you say that, let's say 99% of the people will reject you, but one will love you for it because you are so authentic and they believe the same or something, right?
Maybe. Okay, maybe. But I do agree that there is. So what are the traditions that you feel will be changing? And you were talking about religion. I do hope that, especially in the US, it will become more acceptable to say that you are an atheist. Because I think even saying you are a Muslim is more acceptable than saying you are an atheist right now, in the US at least. Politically, you're not going to be US president if you don't say that you believe Jesus Christ is your savior. And I hope that that's going to change.
For sure. And 25% of Americans are already non-believers. So yeah, I think it's going that direction. And then I think there will be just more liberalization of everything. Like, in relationships, we used to have just one model, one size fits all. Now we will have a lot of different models. Like, we have, for example, living together apart model, where you are in a relationship with someone, but you don't live together because you like to live alone and have the comfort or whatever. There is a lot of different arrangements that are possible, and people are exploring them, and there's less social stigma around it. And especially in the cities, people can shape their lives the way they want to. And it doesn't mean that it will be amazing, but there is a chance that personally, for this person, given their personality type and given their preferences, they will have something that works better than the one-size-fits-none model.
Okay. All right. I'd say one of the traditions that I hope is going to be changing is the treatment of animals. I think animals are treated horribly right now. If you take a look at the way that animals that are destined to be eaten by us are currently suffering in what life they live. And I don't think that we'll ever have the same rights as humans. But I do think that in maybe the future, maybe 50 years from now, we'll look back and we'll say, wow, that was totally unacceptable, the way that we treated animals in 2020.
Yeah. No, this is a very good point. So you see all of those traditions that have something to do with like oppression and violence are slowly fading out, and we become more civilized thanks to also humanism and, well, this animalism. That's another thing. But there is a very interesting theory about animal rights that we are fearing right now that artificial intelligence will be kind of the higher form of intelligence from us, and it will maybe control us at some point. And maybe if we control animals and we treat them so badly, this artificial intelligence will treat us also very badly and very, like exploitively and so on. So maybe if we change our treatment of animals, we hope subconsciously that the machines and the robots and the AI will treat us better as well, like with some standards. So that was an interesting way of thinking.
Okay, so Sebastian, how can we summarize today's discussion?
So it's good to even realize that we are copying certain traditions in our lives, and that there is a choice. There's an element where we decide whether we're gonna follow the tradition or not. Like, we have that choice. Many people don't realize this, I think. So it's important to realize the choice, and then to maybe make your life more unique to your own preferences, disregarding certain traditions and creating maybe your own, while also be careful not to mess up in a major way. Because if you make weekend, I don't know, 10 days long and the working day 1 day, it might backfire in ways that we haven't predicted. Like some people attempt that and they're like, oh my God, this is like boring and I'm getting depressed and like, what's going on, right? So we need a lot of caution and attention, but it's good to question traditions. It's good to recognize the current opportunities that we have that have not been before when we form those traditions. And like more critical thinking in general, just thinking for yourself and acting for yourself and speaking the truth that you believe is the truth needs to happen if we are to evolve the traditions to a new level of harmony and love and peace, and against from like away from violence and oppression and all that.
Okay, yeah, I agree. So we should be aware of that our behavior and our beliefs are influenced by tradition. We should know what kind of beliefs actually we have and what kind of behavior we do because we were influenced by our environment. We should know that even though we might think this is a self-evident truth and immutable behavior, that this is changeable, and we need to know that there are advantages of traditions and there are disadvantages of traditions. Many times it makes sense to keep traditions and not have new traditions, but at the same time, we need to know that certain traditions, if you look at them rationally, they neither make us happy and they neither make us more productive. They're just bad traditions. And we need to be aware of these traditions and then try to stand up for the new tradition, for the new way of doing things, for the new way of thinking about things, even though, as we both know, as we've both experienced, it's sometimes hard to stand up for what you believe in when the majority of society has a different point of view.